Chapter 4 covers the topics of social structure and social interactions, and I consider this to be again another introductory chapter in this particular topic, and so I move it earlier in the semester than it would be in the textbook because of that reason. But this chapter again kind of takes a closer look really at macrosociology and microsociology and many of the elements of those two different ways of analyzing things in sociology. If you can remember, we touched on the notions of macro and microsociology in our lecture in chapter 1. Kind of a way of analyzing things that kind of places the three different perspectives in sociology into whether they're characterized by a larger view of society, which is macrosociology, or a more intimate view of social interactions, which is microsociology. And so there again, large scale versus social interaction, the different levels of analysis in sociology, macro or micro. We first begin by looking at macrosociology and different perspectives and different features of macrosociological perspective. And the first one is the significance of social structure in macrosociology, and looking at the larger picture of a culture, of a sociology rather, of a society I should say. Social structure is a very important piece of understanding how things work from a macro-sociological perspective. The social structure, which is that set of rules and guidelines that are around us, guides our behaviors. It tells us how to act, and it kind of adds some predictability to our world. And also another feature of social structure, which is very important. If you remember from our chapter 1 talk, we talked about social location and how sociologists look at where we're located in the many different ways, the different corners of our existence. And the social structure, one of the things about social structure that you'll notice is that our behavior is decided by our location in the social structure. For instance, in economic, socioeconomic structure, oftentimes the way we view the world and the way we raise our children and the way we think about things like education or gun control or whatever it might be that's a current topic, those things oftentimes are most powerfully shaped by where we are located in the social structure, where our social location is, much more than any other feature in our lives. We'll be talking a lot about that as the semester goes along. So social structure is one part of a macro-sociological look at things. Another part is culture. In culture, sometimes it's kind of used interchangeably with society, but it's really two different things. A culture is a group's language, their beliefs, their values, their behaviors, their gestures, material objects perhaps that they value and they consider to be very important. That is your culture. And so different cultures can exist within a society. If you go to any large city, for instance, there's a Chinatown and there's a Little Italy like in New York City, and and a Koreatown and different kinds of things like that. And so there are certain there are subcultures, but groups of individuals who have their own unique language, beliefs, values, behaviors, gestures, those kinds of things that create a common identity among them. Another piece of the macro-sociological perspective is our social class. And social class, we oftentimes think of it in terms of income, and income is one of those features that divides people, but there are other features that help to divide us in social class, and that is our level of education and our occupation and the prestige of our occupation. In a class society such as we have, one of the ways that we move up in society is through our education. So that those of you who are taking college courses here and pursuing a degree are interested in earning more money, and improving your life. I think this is you have this basic understanding that we're all raised with, that the more education we have, the more likely it is we can climb that social class ladder. And so, education, occupational prestige, and income are elements that help to divide individuals in a culture and group them into social classes. A social status is a position that a person occupies within their class, or really, yeah, well, within their class. So there are two different types of social status, and one is ascribed, the other achieved. An achieved social status is something that you earn. So you may live in a lower socioeconomic household when you grow up. You get a scholarship to college, and you go on to attain a double master's, and then become a Nobel laureate in physics, and and have a doctoral degree from Oxford, or those kinds of things. You clearly have achieved a social status through your efforts, a higher social status than you were born with, and that's achieved social status. On the other hand, an ascribed status is a status that you are born with, and that really stays with you throughout your life. And this would be in some societies, for instance, one's race ascribes a status to you, and some would say in the United States your race ascribes a social status to you. Now, there's a lot of challenges to that belief system anymore, but nonetheless there are many who would still believe that to be true. Being a male or a female may ascribe you a certain social status in a patriarchal society. Certainly it would appear that men have a leg up and have an advantage in our society, and there are any number of indicators in the society around us that demonstrate that, and more about that as the semester goes along as well. So you get the notion there. Well, and then, in India, of course, where they have, they don't really, theoretically, they don't have the caste system anymore, but you perhaps have studied about the untouchables. And these are individuals who are born into the lowest class, and their class is so low that in fact their shadows are not to fall across the paths of individuals of higher social statuses in their society. That's clearly an ascribed status. No one has done anything, that puts them in that status. They were simply born into this particular position in society. So that's one social status. Now, we have many different social statuses, and this is the interesting thing about this, depending upon who we are and what we do. And so a master status is a social status that cuts across all the other statuses you hold. I, for instance, now I'm probably moving into a social status of being an elder, as hard as it is for me to imagine, because I still can remember myself sleeping in the bunk bed in my college dorm at Michigan State way back when. But in any event, that person was many, many years ago, and so I one status that I'm about to achieve in life, I suppose, is to become an elder. I'm among the elderly in society. I'm a male. I have a master's degree. I teach classes, so I'm a college professor. That gives me a certain status. I'm actually a college instructor, I should say. See, that status isn't the same as the college professor. That's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm a supervisor at work, which gives me a status. I have all these different statuses. I'm a father. I'm a pet owner. I'm a homeowner, and I drive a Jeep. All those kinds of things are really kind of things that, they either indicate status or they are a status. And so there are certain things among all those statuses that are the most important, that overshadow everything. And one of them is being a male in a patriarchal society. That is certainly a master status that gives me a lot of prestige. And no matter what other status I might have in my life, being a male gives me a certain privilege, and that's what a master status is. Some would consider race a master status. And again, there are many things to indicate that is the case. Economics, sometimes your economic status can also be a master status. And so the status set is all of those statuses that you hold, basically. That's your status set. Another element in the macrosociological perspective it's important to understand is roles, and these are the behaviors that are associated with your status. So you occupy a status as an elderly person, as a male, as a worker, as a parent, as a student, on and on. But you play a role. So as a student, one of the things that your responsibility is to complete the assignments that the instructor gives you, and you do that. And in theory, now it's not to say that there aren't exceptions to this, but generally speaking, you fulfill those demands. You don't question it. not to say you can't, but generally you don't, because you're a student and you understand your role. And my professor tells me this is what I need to study and this is what I need to do in order to learn and understand these things, and so we do those things. That's the role you're playing, the student role. In your relationship at home, however, you may be the head of the household, as the mother in the home, for instance, with three children, and what you say goes. Well, unless you're the parent of a teenager, in which case then what you say is negotiable. But generally speaking, you are the leader of the home, and so when you make decisions not only for yourself but for everyone else, and everyone else pretty much has to live with that and go along with it. So you see, your status is different in the home. Your role's very different, and so your roles change as your status change. It's an important thing to keep in mind. We have many roles, we have many statuses, but we occupy a status but play a role. Some other concepts within the macrosociological perspective. This is again that big perspective that we're looking at on how it influences individuals, are the groups that we belong to. And a group is a collection of individuals who regularly and consciously interact and think of themselves as belonging together. So if you attend religious services routinely, that's one group in your life, your church. The people who are in your work unit, perhaps at work, are a group, because you interact regularly, you interact, and you think of yourselves as belonging together. Your family is a group. And any organizations, clubs you belong to, of course, are groups, AA, those kinds of things. So there's the groups. Now that's different, and later on when we look at groups more closely, we'll assess that a little bit more, because a group is different from a crowd. So for instance, if you go to a basketball game at the high school, that's not a group, because these are not people while they're together. They don't consciously interact. They're not together thinking we're going to be together to watch this game tonight. And even if they are, they're not there regularly, and they don't really see themselves belonging together. Now, a group of basketball enthusiasts, say, who support a particular high school's team, that's a group who may be in the crowd, but the crowd is also made up of other individuals who don't belong to that. And so a crowd is different from a group, because the group is aware of being together and see themselves as belonging together. Social institutions are another element to consider in the macrosociological perspective, and this is the means that society develops to meet its basic needs. Now, social institutions really, we're talking about the structural functionalist perspective here. If you remember that image of the engine with all those parts that have to work together in a certain way for the engine to run smoothly, those institutions are those parts, the cylinders and the covers and the gaskets and all those other kinds of things that interact together to make our society run smoothly. And the society's institutions include things like we talked about: education, family, religion, law, the military, the media, and on and on and on. I think our text identifies something around 15 different institutions in society, and we'll be studying many of them this semester. The more industrialized a society, the more formal the institutions are. So that in a sort of a less industrialized, more agricultural society, there are fewer institutions, and but as society becomes more and more complex, those institutions begin to take on specific roles in order to facilitate the functioning of that society. We talk a little bit about societies, which is, of course, I think that really the kind of the largest group that is studied in sociology is a society, and when you look at macrosociology, then what we're looking at is a society and what makes society run. And so when we look at societies throughout history, societies have transformed because of the introduction of something new into the world, and this is essentially an innovation or an invention. And so if we go back to prehistory days, let's say, our societies were hunters and gatherers. This is that, the people, you think about the cavemen, I guess, the cave people, and in those days, the generally the male of the species went out and did the hunting wherever the animals were, brought the meat back to the home. Were given lots of rewards, sexual favors, and first privileges at the table. Some say this is where the whole notion of patriarchy begins, by the way. Because they have brought this food into for the family and everything, they're giving all these special privileges. The women stay behind to take care of the children, perhaps gather berries and things near wherever the family is living, or where this group of people that would be considered a prehistoric family lived. They might gather whatever berries might be growing in the bushes or leaves or whatever that they might be able to eat. That's a hunter and gatherer. Now, there wasn't many social divisions in those days. It was a very hand-to-mouth kind of existence, and everybody contributed more or less. And so, when there weren't many social divisions, that means that things were pretty equal. There are some hunter-gatherer societies continue to exist today. Actually, this says something about 300 around the world, but they're pretty well. This would suggest that there's still 300 of them out there, but I think they're pretty obscure for the most of us in this world. One of the things about hunter and gatherer societies is they tend to be very nomadic, because as they hunt and they gather, they kind of deplete the resources of the area, and they have to move again to another area where those resources are more plentiful. And so they don't really associate themselves with the location so much. They are more nomadic in nature. Somewhere along the line, somebody figured out that you can raise plants and you can raise animals, and you wouldn't have to move around to have them. And that's the innovation that I'm talking about here, the domestication of plants and animals that happened in prehistory. And so the hunters and gatherers began to settle down and locate, and two different kinds of societies actually developed, and that's the pastoral and horticultural societies, that either pasturing animals or actually, I guess, learning to raise have plants growing nearby and everything, and to be able to seed them and things like that. Perhaps a location becomes more solid. And so it isn't just that they've changed now and they've started raising animals perhaps or anything like this, but actually life changes because they settle down. They stay in one place. You see, the whole notion of what it means to exist becomes different with this. That's what's called a social revolution. And so the first social revolution is the evolution of societies from hunter and gatherers to pastoral and horticultural societies. Somebody invents the plow, which, as you can imagine, becomes much more. It makes growing plants much more possible, and those kinds of things. And so we then develop agricultural societies where people can produce large amounts of food to not only feed their own families, but to market to others. And what do you think might happen with that? Well, we begin maybe before, where they were bartering for things. Now we have one person with more resources than they need, and so they don't necessarily need to barter, and perhaps they sell things for cash. And so a cash economy begins to develop. That's a huge change in existence. When you're trading things off back and forth with other people to get what you live, to be able to sell things now, and so money becomes something that's real. And as Weber would tell you, or perhaps it was Marx, one of those two, or all of those two, both of those would tell you that with the introduction of cash money into the world, capitalism develops. And in order for that's the profit motive, and so the whole way that people exist with each other and get along with each other changes. It's around this time, I think, when feudal estates have been established, but as more and more and more this becomes a cash-based society, feudalism goes away, and we have our first group of homeless people out there, but that's for later study. So with agricultural society, peoples develop cities, and cultures begin to develop where they actually begin to associate together, stay together, and develop a common identity. And sometimes, people think of this as the dawn of civilization, but in any event, that's the next social revolution was the agricultural society. And then comes along the steam engine. And now, this wasn't all that long ago when you look at the history of man. And so you can see change occurring more rapidly now. And the steam engine is invented, and that enables us to become an industrialized society. People move to the cities now where there is actually work. And in agricultural societies where families stayed together and everybody in the family participated in one way or another, growing crops or taking care of the animals, milking the cows, gathering the eggs, sewing and knitting or whatever. Now we have people leaving the home to go to work. And get this, it's not only that they're leaving home to go to work. Think about the changes that occurs in the family because of that. For instance, the parent leaving the home now isn't there to interact routinely with children of the family. And so parenting begins to change, and children don't always have their parent at hand to learn from, or so maybe schools begin to develop where there's teachers that are trained to instruct and teach, and so the influences on children come from different sources suddenly. Likewise, instead of the man, and some say masculinity, the concept of masculinity changes with the industrialization of the world, because men no longer provide directly for their family by the fruit of their own labor, literally speaking, but now men become dependent upon another man, that is their boss, to pay them for the work that they do so that they can then go purchase things for their families. What it means to be a man and a provider changes dramatically. The roles of the family become changed also, as women now are really much more closely tied to the home and family. But the domain of the outside world generally is given to the men. So it's politics and work becomes the men's field, and staying at home and raising children and nurturance is the women's job. And these are the kinds of things, again, these changes not only change that we can produce a lot of things in factories that we couldn't produce before. It also changes the very existence, the very fabric of life, another social revolution. And then one that is much more recent, the invention of the computer chip. And some of you in that class along with me were around when this happened and can remember when computers came into being. When I went to college, and it seems like it wasn't all that long ago, but perhaps it was, I remember my roommate going to the computer center on campus. This was Michigan State, and there were 44,000 students at the time, and walking a mile to the computer center to run his program. And when I went back to visit the campus, 10 years later or 15 years later with my oldest son, one of the things that I noticed first of all was walking in the bookstore and seeing personal computers all around the walls. There wasn't any such thing as PCs when I was in school, and now all of a sudden students had computers in their rooms instead of walking the mile to the computer center to do something on the computer. And of course, those computers are very, very different from the ones we have today. And in fact, I know that many of you are doing your lessons on your phones now, and your iPads and your tablets and your laptops that you carry with you. And so wherever you are, you can attend your class. Just the very existence of online education is an example of this social revolution, and how the computer chip has so dramatically changed the world. And not only with education, but think about personal relationships and how many people have begun to meet partners and spouses online. How many people share things in chat rooms, private things with people they've never met, that they would never share with somebody on a face-to-face basis. Things that they tell others about themselves, perhaps. Does it redefine what intimacy is? Does it change the nature of human interactions? These are things that remain to be seen, but my guess is the answer to those questions are yes. This is the computer chip is you're in the midst of this social revolution. You'll continue to see change in your lifetime as well from this, and it is truly a social revolution. And so now it's not so much what we produce, it's the information that we have that makes us more powerful in this society. So this is how society has transformed over time, and it is an innovation or an invention, some new combination of existing elements. That's an innovation and invention that causes us to see things in a different way and to do things differently. That's what creates a social revolution. More about this later on in the semester as well. So as societies evolve and change, things have to keep them together. There's something that has to kind of blend them and connect them and cement them together. And so Durkheim and Tönnies both had different perspectives or theories about this, but Durkheim looked at how our solidarity changed from a mechanical to an organic solidarity, so that we went from a society where people were connected by shared tasks, say the family all working together, to produce the food on the table and the clothing on their backs and everything in agricultural societies, to organic solidarity where there's a division of responsibility and, well, debatable who does what, but the men do some things, the women do the other things, the children do certain things like get their education and prepare for the future, the older people provide for the children, those kinds of things. And so Durkheim sees an evolution of how society continues to work there, from sharing tasks to dividing responsibility. Tönnies talks about different kinds of societies evolving, and generally he says that societies evolve from personal close-knit societies called Gemeinschaft societies into impersonal societies that are called Gesellschaft societies. So the small farming communities in the villages even in rural America 100 years ago, some still exist, but by and large, those have given way now to the larger impersonal society where you might live next door to somebody and not know who they are. I have a great example of this, again, from my own life. My mother and father actually rented a house the whole time I grew up. I was the youngest of 5 boys, and we lived on a corner. We lived in one half of a double house, and so in the other half was the Hall family. Across the street were the Joneses. Kitty-cornered across that intersection were the Schwartzes, and the Schwartzes were actually the grandparents of Mrs. Jones, who was actually a Wagner, and her mother lived 2 doors down the street from her. Okay, across the street from the Schwartzes, and to the left across the street from us, were the Supers. And so the Supers, the Schwartzes, the Joneses, the Galics, the Halls, the Wagners. There was one house where people moved in and out while we were there, but by and large, nobody moved from these homes. The whole time I grew up, the same families lived here. And in fact, in the Super home, when Grandpa Super died, this younger Super moved in with and raised his family there. It was this kind of thing that everybody knew everybody. We knew each other's values. We shared values because we lived on the same corner. And if my mother and father went away for a day, they knew that if anything went wrong, there was somebody that we would go to for help. And if we did anything wrong, we also knew somebody would tell my mom and dad when we came home. And so this is really a Gemeinschaft society, a very personal society. But 15, 20 years later, after I'm out of college and I moved to Central Florida, and I live in an apartment complex that has actually 8 apartments that used one common entrance. They were outdoor entrances, but 4 apartments downstairs, 4 apartments upstairs, so 8 people. I lived in this apartment for 5 or 6 years, and aside from occasional banging on the wall because somebody's music was too loud, nobody knew anybody. Nobody met anybody. We didn't know each other's names. We said hello to each other as we moved past, but that was that. So that's really an impersonal society, and this theory says that this is how societies are evolving even as they stay together. So now we move on to the microsociological perspective, and this really if conflict theory and functionalist perspectives were associated with macrosociology, this is the one that focuses upon social interactionist or structural interactional theory. And microsociology perspective, first of all, there's some concepts here that are worth looking at. One is stereotypes, and stereotypes are assumptions about the characteristics of certain individuals which lead to generalizations about that group. So, as this little chart shows us, we see features of a person or hear things about that person that causes us to fit them into stereotypes, and we begin to expect, because of the things we've heard about this person or this group of persons, them to act a certain way. That's what the stereotype is, and this kind of shapes our attitudes and actions towards that, and the other person then gets the idea of how we perceive them, and sometimes that behaviors of that person will change to match our expectations, so it confirms the stereotype. There's a good example of interactionalist theory. How our beliefs about one person are perceived by the other person and causes that person to change to meet our beliefs. And likewise, that happens the other way around. We look for what people believe in us, see in us. We evaluate that against what we believe about ourselves, and we may change some of what we do or see, how we feel about ourselves, in order to meet what we believe other people think of us. It doesn't even have to be true that they think that, but it's only that we believe that. So in any event, a stereotype are these large assumptions we have about characteristics of individuals, and this is an example of why sometimes those stereotypes get fulfilled. Another concept in microsociology is about personal space, and this is Edward Hall. We hear about the bubble, right? And we all have our little personal bubble, and when people get too close, we feel it. Now, the shape of the bubble really depends upon a number of different things, including sometimes your age, but also your cultural background, your ethnic background. So some cultures, personal space is you can get very, very, very close to another person, and it's not considered a violation of personal space. Some cultures are very big into hugging, and others are very distant and don't ever hug. And so there are a number of different things that impact our sense of personal space, how big our bubble is, so to speak. But Hall, I believe, identified 4 different levels of personal space, and that's the intimate, all through the public. So let's say, for instance, the public, the public perspective, when you're just conducting business with somebody, you probably have a 3 feet, 4 feet distance, where you're conducting business across a counter, or you're talking to somebody, about a real estate transaction or something like that. There's a fair amount of distance that everybody respects, and if that real estate agent becomes too close, you begin to feel a little like, this is kind of icky. It's because they're not supposed to. If you're social friends with somebody, though, and you're at a party, that space shrinks quite a bit, and it would probably be less than arm's length. It might be arm's length, but probably less than arm's length that you stand next to the person in a social environment when you're talking with that individual. You may be much closer, but not necessarily personal, so that they're so close that that you're going to reach out and hug each other or something like that. And in a personal kind of thing, when you're sitting and watching television or something like this, you might be much more close to an individual. And finally, the intimate level, of course, where there's literally no space between you, and this is restricted. Hopefully, at least it's restricted to, well, okay, not passing judgment here, but for most people, I'd say that intimate level of personal space is restricted to a select few individuals in one's life. Irving Goffman was a sociologist who wrote a lot about the world around us, and his theory, really, he wrote about what was called dramaturgy, and this is the theory where his belief is that life is like a play, and that we play roles, and we stage certain things in order to get through the day. He used an example, I think, of, well, maybe he didn't, but I've seen examples of this used, at least, of restaurants, for instance. When you go into a restaurant, oftentimes you'll find the chef wearing white clothes, and white, of course, popular thinking in America, white means cleanliness, and so this implies that the kitchen is clean. You know, the food may be presented in a certain way that makes it look more attractive. And when I worked in the dormitory cafeteria in my dorm at Michigan State, I can remember my supervisor telling us that presentation of the food, even on the cafeteria line, was three-quarters of the job. Much more even than preparing good food was making sure it looked good, and that the students, the residents, would enjoy it much more if it looked good. And I think there's every bit of truth to that. So how things are presented is a very key thing in Goffman's theory, and this is about. Well, impression management is another thing with face-saving behavior and those kinds of things that it all has to do with how we come across to others and controlling how we present ourselves, how our image is out there in the public. And there's a front stage and a backstage, and this is demonstrated by how you may conduct yourself in the business world, but when you get home and you let your hair down, so to speak, and you kick your shoes off, you may be a very different person at home. Most of us are. This front stage and backstage, and as well as in the business. You know, if in an office setting, for instance, you know, where you have a professional front that you have to carry into the community. When the individuals are out in the community presenting whatever they present in the community, come back, how they act around each other and the things that they say are very, very different. And so that's the backstage of that presentation. Another element of dramaturgy is Goffman looked at was role conflict and role strain. And when you have two different roles, remember we have different statuses, and so then oftentimes we have different roles. And so when there's a conflict between two separate roles that you have, that's considered role conflict. For instance, as a student and as a single parent, you may find yourselves at time unable to attend class or to take care of the homework responsibilities that you have because your children have a school play. And you have to make a choice. Am I going to be a good student and get this work done in time, or am I going to be a good mother or father and attend this school's play, or attend this child's play, or go to his sporting event, or her band concert, or whatever it might be? That's a role conflict, and the more roles you play, the more conflict you're going to experience in your life, and we all play a lot of roles. So this is the source of a fair amount of what we call stress these days. Role conflict. Role strain is a strain within the same role. And let me see if I can present this. For instance, as a parent, sometimes when you really want to provide for your child certain things that they want, and you want them to be happy, but you may know that what the child wants isn't something that's good for him, and so you deny that certain thing, and it causes you a lot of anxiety or agony because you want your child to be happy and you want your child to have what they have, but this isn't good for them and they don't understand it. That's a example of role strain. So here's an illustration. You have many different roles. So, as a son or daughter, friend, student, and worker, you have different responsibilities there, and you have to choose which one or how to fit them all in. That's role conflict. Role strain is where, as a student, you want to do well in your classes, but you also don't want to make the other students look bad, so you don't want to score too high, maybe. That's role strain. Ethnomethodology, another phrase, another element in microsociology that is worth thinking about also. And this is the study of how people use their background assumptions to get through everyday life. Break that down, and you see the first part of that word is ethno. And so think about this in terms of cultures and ethnic considerations. I'm a white American male. I was raised in central Pennsylvania in a Roman Catholic household that they emphasized us going to church, although my parents, interestingly, didn't really go to church much themselves until I was an older child. But we went to church. We went to Mass every week. So that tells you a little bit about kind of my roots. along with those roots come filters and belief systems, so that growing up in central Pennsylvania, a lot of people around me were hunters, and so that may one of those assumptions that growing up in central Pennsylvania might be a part of my worldview is that it's guns are, a part of life, and we have a right to have guns, and that guns are very useful, and no one should take the guns away from me. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. In fact, I don't. But most people around me that grew up then did. Being white, there are certain assumptions about what I expect of the world, and perhaps what I see of other people that may influence the way I interact with the world, and what I expect of the world. Being male, likewise, certain privileges and things like this. And so, being Catholic, my description of morality is also filtered through the things that I was taught as a child, and these things are taught to us so early that we don't know they're not real. We think this is the way the world is, and this is what is our background assumption. These are the things that we assume to be the way the world ought to be, and the way the world ought to deal with us. These are our background assumptions, and so all of us have different background assumptions. And one of the mistakes we make in our life, and one of the reasons there are troubles in the world, is because we assume our background assumptions. We assume that other people should have the same beliefs, and they don't, because they've had different experiences and different teachings. And so ethnomethodology is really the study of how people using those background assumptions, and how we do that to get through life. We create certain expectations of others to get us through the day. Garfinkel writes about experiments in ignoring the basic rules of social life, and these are little things we'll talk about again a little bit later on in life. But that, for instance, you open the door for somebody in front of you, you hold the door for somebody behind you. I don't know. These are things that certainly was a part of my growth, and I just assumed everybody has those same understanding. That you don't let a door fall flat or fall closed or in somebody's face right behind you. But I found, for instance, that with the children that I adopted, some of them didn't have that understanding, and indeed had to be taught to hold those things. These are basic rules of social life that I consider basic rules, that may or may not be, but you don't even notice those basic rules until they're violated, and then you know it. Again, just some other things in microsociology and how they impact our interactions with each other. W.I. Thomas his theorem says that our behavior depends not on the objective but on the subjective interpretation of reality. That is, that we behave according to the way we perceive the world. In fact, there are those who think that, and you'll hear this again, that reality is a social construct. What is real is really real because we agree it's real, but everybody doesn't necessarily agree that way. So keep that in mind. Our behavior depends not on objective, but on subjective interpretations of reality, what we believe inside. That's some of the most basic kind of elements when we look at microsociology and macrosociology. And just some things. You'll be hearing more of these terms as the semester goes along, but just thought that it would be useful for you to be exposed to some of these now. Should you have any questions about any of this material, please do email me or give me a call. Emailing, again, is probably a better way to reach me. And we'll be talking more next week. Bye for now.